Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this joint AHDB and BGS webinar discussing Herbal Leys, delivering livestock performance and environmental improvements. My name is Tom Goatman. I'm the CEO of British Grassland Society. The decision to hold the webinar this evening has stemmed from growing interest in Herbal Leys and the potential opportunities that they offer. There are a number of large-scale research projects underway in the UK and across Europe. BGS had planned to hold a research conference on the topic of multi-species swards in March, but unfortunately this had to be cancelled due to the impact of COVID-19. Also, following the extremely dry spring that we've just had, AHDB have received increased interest from producers keen to find out more about the potential Herbal Leys could offer in helping to build resilience into forage systems. We therefore thought it timely to work together to facilitate a discussion on the topic of Herbal Leys and provide answers to questions that you may have regarding your own experiences of growing them to date, or perhaps integrating them into your systems for the first time in 2021. We have an excellent panel of speakers lined up this evening, and I hope you enjoyed the discussions. I'll now hand across to Becky Miles from AHDB, who will be facilitating the webinar to outline how it will be managed and introduce our panel. Becky.
Thank you, Tom, and good evening, everyone. I'll run through the housekeeping, introduce our speakers, and facilitate the question and answer session, and do my very best to keep us to time. For today's webinar, everyone is muted, but we would like you to ask questions using the question function at the side of your screen throughout the webinar. To find the question box, click on the orange box with an arrow in the top right-hand side of your screen, and you will see the box. You can also use the webcam button at the top to change your view. All questions you ask are private and your identity won't be publicly displayed. If we can't answer your question during this evening's webinar, we will get back to you later. If you would like to record your attendance at this webinar for Dairy Pro Points, please enter into the chat box your membership number or your full address, including postcode, along with your email and date of birth. If you have any technical problems, I'm afraid the standard advice is the simplest: turn it off and turn it back on again. We will be using a poll function at 3 stages throughout this evening to gauge what potential further delivery is required on this topic to satisfy demand. We know there's a lot of interest because we've had over 400 registrations for this evening's webinar. So to get us started, we'll have our first poll, which will give us an understanding of how many of you are currently using Herbal Leys and how long you have been using them. So if you could use your mouse to select one of the options. That's brilliant. That's really interesting. Thank you. I hope you can all see that. So 48% of you not using, 20% 1 to 2 years, 6% 3 to 5, 8% 6 years plus, and 19% are obviously stakeholders or not applicable. Thank you very much for that. So I'll now introduce our speakers. We're very fortunate to have Sam Lane, who is the technical manager at Cotswold Seeds. He studied for his degree at Harper Adams University in Shropshire, after which he worked for 4 years at the Swimbrook Estate in Oxford. He then joined Cotswold Seeds 6 years ago, and as well as providing farmers with advice on complex grass seed mixtures and visiting farms all over the country, Sam is actively involved with FarmEd, the new centre for food and farming education. We also have Paul Muto, who works as a senior specialist in grassland agronomy for Natural England. His recent work has focused on monitoring the legume and herb-rich ley agri-environment option and investigating biodiverse leys with the Institute of Grassland Science at the University of Göttingen. A strong advocate of agroecological approaches to sustainable agriculture, Paul has been involved in organic agriculture, grazing systems management and agroforestry. When not at work, he can be found on his allotment or trying to catch a fish somewhere, so the fish are having an easy evening. Then we have Professor Chris Reynolds. Chris is a Professor of Animal and Dairy Science and the Director of the Centre for Dairy Research at the University of Reading. His previous research primarily focused on the nutritional physiology of ruminants in relation to their energy and protein metabolism. More recent research has focused on the management of ruminants to reduce environmental impacts of milk and meat production through reduced methane and nitrogen emissions, and the use of legumes and multi-species swards to improve the sustainability and the resilience of ruminant production systems. And finally, but not least, we have Rob Richmond, who owns and manages a 200 cow herd at Manor Farm in the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire. The dairy there produces organic milk from multi-species swards containing 20 different species. The springbok calving cows are predominantly Friesian and Shorthorn genetics, but the future aim is to have a cow that is an equal mix of New Zealand Holstein, red and white Holstein, and Fleckley genetics. Rob undertook a Nuffield in 2010-2011, looking at soil carbon, and this has formed the basis of how he works now, using highly varied Leys to provide constant ground cover and returning organic materials such as composted farmyard manure and slurry to the soil to further increase soil organic matter levels, especially important on the thin brashy soils at the farm. Milk output provides a guide as to how well the pastures are performing. Rob aims to produce milk from forage as far as possible, reducing reliance on expensive organic concentrates. So without further ado, I will hand over to Sam Lane from Cotswold Seeds, who's going to take us through how to select and grow herbal Leys. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Becky. Yeah, hope you can hear me okay. So we know that herbal Leys are a mix of grasses, legumes and forage herbs. But interestingly, not every plant will grow on every soil type. So below is a simple guide to some of the species you might consider if you're thinking of dipping a toe into the world of these herbal Leys. Briefly looking at some of the species you might use. So on the lighter soils, for example, the grasses cocksfoot, very deep rooted, did particularly well in a drought in 2018. It's about the only grass I saw putting on any growth in 2018, about this time of year. Also tall fescue, another very deep rooted, drought resistant plant. Sandcoin and lucerne, sort of similar stable mates really, they're very deep rooting pasture legumes, particularly good on dry soils. And again, this spring, summer, we've seen the lucerne really coming back strongly, having been either cut or grazed. Sweet clover, another deep rooted legume, very aggressive taproot system. And then the forage herbs, yarrow and sheep's parsley, both suiting the drier soils rather than the heavier stuff. However, if you are on the heavier soils, you might consider a couple of the grasses. So timothy in particular is a very good heavier land plant, along with meadow fescue. And of course the ryegrasses. We've got a whole range of ryegrasses to choose from the short-term upright cutting grasses, or maybe the longer-term perennials for grazing. If we think about legumes for a second, things like all-site clover, which is a specific species in its own right, does suit the heavier, wetter soils, maybe lower pHs as well. And of course, red clover. And then some of the forage herbs, so burnet is a particularly deep-rooted forage herb, which will suit the heavier soils as well as the lighter stuff as well. And then finally, some of the all-rounders, as I like to call them, some species that do pretty well on most soils and are relatively easy to grow. So chicory and plantain, or ribgrass, as the Kiwis tend to call it. Birdsfoot trefoil, another useful legume, again, very green in 2018 in sort of July and August time. White clover, pretty adaptable all over the place, really. And then the festrulolium, which we might talk about later with some specific questions on that. The festrulolium being a crossing between ryegrass and fescue, normally tall or meadow fescue. Okay, if you can click the slide on, please, Chloe. Thank you. And then really, again, if we are thinking of dipping our toe into this interesting herbal Ley world, there are definitely a few pointers to think about when we're establishing our Leys. In no particular order, really, but they must be sown in warm soil. So if we think of many of these mixtures have a lot of legumes in them, they are very specific to soil temperature. So sort of 7-8 degrees consistently and on the rise. So I'd be thinking of sowing these probably from late April onwards. And of course, the same at the other end of the season, not sowing too late into the autumn. So probably aiming for sort of end of August, early September, rather than mid-September. And then if we get a rain delay or something creeping into the back end of September. Depth is also definitely a consideration. So small seeds, legumes, forage herbs, they must be sown nice and shallow. Aim for no deeper than 1 centimetre, one of the #1 causes of poor establishment on these herbal lays is sowing too deep. And then we get a patchy, slow take, and that's when the weeds come in and things don't go very well from there. And finally, a well-consolidated seed bed. So after sowing, definitely roll it well. I would be tempted to roll it twice. It's the sort of cheapest pass you'll do, and it's amazing how it evens up the establishment on the headlands and the middle of the field. But also, if you have created the seed bed by ploughing and power harrowing, this can also lead a very puffy surface. So again, I'd be tempted to consolidate that before sowing, again, just to get it as an even establishment as possible. And hopefully, once we've got something showing, once the lay is starting to establish, we might look to graze it 5 to 6 weeks later. Again, especially in warm conditions, a little bit of moisture. It's amazing how these lays can really race away. Just looking to take the top off them and maybe encourage the lay to till up and thicken up. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. We'll go on now to Paul Muto, who's going to cover herbal lays in agri-environment, lessons learned and moving ahead. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, hi, my name is Paul Muto and I work as a specialist in grassland agronomy for Natural England. You can move on to the next slide, please, Becky. Natural England has promoted herbal lays since the introduction of our herbal lay option in 2013. And since then, we have currently there are about 1,700 hectares in the environmental stewardship or ELS-HLS part of the scheme. In 2016, environmental stewardship was replaced by countryside stewardship, and currently we have almost 9,000 hectares that are being funded as herbal lays. That the figures that I've quoted include both organic and inorganic versions of the option. As Natural England, we do like to monitor and evaluate how well our options are doing in the field. So we had 2 DEFRA funded studies, one in 2014 and one in 2017, which was looking at evaluating how well the option was meeting the requirements of the funded options. It's quite a complex report, but both studies did indicate that meeting the plant diversity targets is sometimes a challenge, but there were definitely improvements in soil quality, particularly in arable systems. So that was a very positive outcome of the studies. Next slide, please. From my own experience, there's 2 main ways in which herbal lays are being used. One is the introduction of lays into arable rotations. This is particularly on farms that are in continuous arable, and due to a variety of reasons, farmers are beginning to look at incorporating some kind of lay into the rotation. So the herbal lay option has become quite popular, particularly for the control of blackgrass. Farmers realize that they need to diversify their rotation and perhaps have a phase of the rotation that will help to improve soil and to break weed cycles. So with the growing awareness of soil health, the need to improve soil structure and soil organic matter has also helped to promote the herbal lay option. Not only that, but having the grass reintroduced into arable rotations has encouraged some farmers to reintroduce livestock into arable systems, which again has made the farming system more sustainable and has helped to improve soil conditions. The other way that the herbal lay option is being used is to create more diverse grassland. So farmers who are currently using perennial ryegrass, white clover, temporary grasslands are replacing it with herbal lays. We also have had farms that are interested in shifting totally out of arable into permanent grass. And in this case, farmers have looked at the herbal lay option as a way to establish permanent grassland. However, there are some issues with that, and I'll get to those in a minute. Also, some farmers are interested in looking at just diversifying their existing grass. The option can only be used on what's considered non-permanent grass, so it had to have been at least in an arable rotation within the last 5 years. So both ways that it's being used are totally valid with the way the option has been designed. There are a few issues with the payment rates that have been calculated for the option. Tend to work quite well with the arable rotation use. However, when we look at creating more diverse grassland, there's often some issues with by years 4 and 5, the diversity of the sward has declined, so we're not sure whether we're getting the pollinator provision that the option was set out to do. Okay, just to look to the future, if you could shift to the next slide, please, Becky. So in the future, we're looking at ELMS, which is the replacement scheme for countryside stewardship. And under that, there's two things that DEFRA's looking at. One is to maintain or adopt managed grazing systems using diverse mixtures. So this is an option essentially for semi-permanent grassland where we're looking at incorporating herbal Leys, but also some type of managed grazing, rotational grazing, or mobbed grazing into the system. The other way is to create and maintain herbal Leys, so essentially a continuation of the herbal Ley option. So we recognize that herbal Leys have been a successful and important tool for farmers, and the question is, how do we get the most out of them? So that wraps it up for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. We now move on to Professor Chris Reynolds, Herbal Leys and Animal Performance. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Becky, and good evening, everyone. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are a number of reasons that we might be interested in sowing multi-species swords or herbal Leys. I won't go through all these that are on the slide, but it's important to remember that if these mixtures include legumes, then that means we'll be relying less on nitrogen fertilizer, which is an important attribute, and they may have many animal health benefits, which is something to consider. Some of the concerns or question marks around herbal Leys are their nutritional value and our options for analyzing their nutrient composition. There are certainly questions about the use of near-infrared spectroscopy for analysis of multi-species swords. And they are more heterogeneous, so they're more variable throughout the year and from season to season, and so they're less straightforward to manage. About 5 years ago, we realized that there had been quite a bit of research on multi-species swords from an agronomics perspective, but quite a bit less research had been conducted on their benefits for animals and their nutritional value. So we started a 5-year project in collaboration with Rothamsted, Dutchy College, and Cotswold Seeds. It was funded by the SARIC program, and then we called it the Diverse Forages Project. So I'm just going to quickly show you some of the preliminary data from our project, which is just coming to an end now. We sowed 4 mixtures for this project. We had a control, which was perennial ryegrass, that received the equivalent of 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And then we had 3 treatments, which were multi-species swords that did not receive any nitrogen fertilizer for the life of the project. These included one we call smart grass, which contained 6 species, 2 grasses, 2 legumes, and 2 herbs, a 12 species mixture we called biomix, and a 17 species mixture, which was Cotswold Seeds Herbal Ley mixture. And this figure shows the biomass that was harvested annually from these mixtures over the course of 3 years of the study. And you can see in the first year, the ryegrass produced more biomass than the other mixtures. In the second year, the mixtures performed reasonably similarly. Smartgrass was slightly lower. But in the third year, the multi-species swords all outperformed the ryegrass that was receiving nitrogen fertilizer. And again, these mixtures did not receive nitrogen fertilizer. So this could have been due to the fact that the legumes had had more time to establish, and it also may have been because year 2 and year 3 were drier years. That was 2018 and 2019. Next slide, please. The other thing to consider with these multi-species swords in terms of providing biomass for animals to consume is there are going to be differences in the production of these swords over the course of the growing season. This is some data from our Dutchy College site down in Cornwall, And you can see that over the course of the season, the perennial ryegrass produced more early in the season, whereas the mixtures produce more later in the season. And this is similar to what we would expect for grasses compared to legumes and other herbs. Next slide, please. We conducted 2 years of grazing work with growing beef cattle, and I can summarize the results of that by simply saying there was no difference in average growth rate of these growing steers in either season. In the first season, they averaged a kilogram of gain per day. In the second, there were bigger steers that started the study, and their average growth rate was about 800 grams per day, but no difference across these treatments. Next slide, please. We also looked at the intake and digestibility of these swords. We did some cut and carry work with animals in digestion stalls. There was no difference in the digestibility of these mixtures, suggesting that they had a similar nutritional value in terms of digestible energy for the animals. So this is some work that we've, again, these are preliminary data, but this is some work with growing animals. There's less data available from a research perspective for lactating cows, but next slide, please. There is one study that's come out of INRA in France, where lactating dairy cows graze multi-species swords compared to perennial ryegrass. And in that study, the multi-species swords, the animals that were grazing those swords actually produced slightly more milk due to a greater dry matter intake. Finally, then, the next slide, please. One question that often comes up is how do we assess the amount of material in these swords if we're going to manage the grazing of them? And we have 3 years of plate meter data for these swords. This is, again, preliminary data from the first year of the study. And the one thing you can see is that the predicted or the actual biomass relative to the compressed sward height using the plate meter is lower for the multi-species swords compared to the ryegrass, which suggests we'll need to calibrate our plate meters differently when we're using multi-species swords, depending on the composition and the maturity of that sword. But again, we'll have 3 years worth of data from the project that we'll be summarizing and publishing in this regard. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That's fascinating. Right, we'll move on to Rob Richmond now. So building soils with multi-species swords. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, good evening. If we move on to the next slide, that's it. When we started running Manor Farm on Herbal Leys, the emphasis was on growing forage without nitrogen. What I've learned along the way is that by doing that and not focusing on soluble nutrients, if you're focusing on soluble nutrients, adding soluble nutrients to these swords, the plants get lazy, they shallow root and just live off the sweeties that we are feeding them. If we're not supplying the soluble nutrients and start allowing the plants to grow, then we develop a much bigger leaf system. The leaf system is the plant's solar panel. So the bigger the solar panel it has, the more sunshine it can collect. The more sunshine it collects, the more carbon dioxide and water it converts into sugars. As the plant grows, this amount of sugar is greater than what the plant actually needs for its own growth. So it starts sequestering the rest of it into the soil to feed the microbes, encouraging the microbes to colonize around the roots and supply the plant with nutrients. This system is what Dr. Christine Jones calls a liquid carbon pathway. It's by far the greatest way to build soil carbon. There is far more important than trampling forage on the surface. The important thing to do is keep as much green growing leaf area on the fields as possible throughout the year. Managing these swards for milk production, we need to graze them just before they're flowering and heading to keep the quality of the sward for the cow, but we can allow these swards to get as tall as possible without overgrazing them, so we get rapid regrowth. And in so doing, these plants have the ability to produce a huge amount of sugar and feed the soil. Our soils, if you look at the picture on the right, I actually found a place on the Cotswolds where I could find 13 to 15 inches of soil. Normally we get 4 to 8 inches. When I first started, the top 3 inches was a light brown colour. Below that, it was a yellowy calcium colour. As you can see now, this particular field has been in a herbal ley for 10 years, and we now have 14, 15 inches of dark soil obtained through carbon sequestration. Conservatively, I think we're sequestering somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year to obtain the gains we've got. The photo on the left is, the left-hand side of that is this 10-year ley at the moment, which is grass and clover dominant, very few herbs. The one on the right is a young ley, which shows much more diversity. As grasslands mature and the soils improve under them, they do tend much more towards grass dominance. The legumes tend to stay in there. When our soils were much poorer when we first established, we got a real red clover chicory dominance in the early days because they have root systems which can open soil structure and extract nutrients from the soil. As the biology builds and as we build the carbon, then the grasses can compete much more and they gradually take over. Younger swards, we don't see the same dominance with the red clover and the chicory, so we get a much more even spread of legumes with a lot more trefoils in there, and those trefoils persist through the age of the sward. We've got 7, 8-year-old swards now with good levels of trefoil as well as the clover and the grasses. If I have the next slide, please. So as I said, we're sequestering a huge amount of carbon per hectare per year in order to build the soil carbon levels that we've built. As I said before, it was sort of 3 to 4% organic matter in the top 3 inches of soil. Today we have 8 to 10% in 12 to 15 inches of soil, which is a huge difference over 10 to 12 years. This has given us increased forage production, improved water management. These soils will absorb water when it's wet, they will get rid of the surplus, and in dry conditions that that moisture is then picked up by the plant and we can keep growth going. This year growth persisted right up to the rains starting about 3 weeks since, and growth since then has been tremendous. We get improved mineral balance as the organic matter in the soil builds up, and we build the humus, it balances out spikes in mineral availability, and gradually the swards will become much richer in nutrients. On the Cotswolds, we're very high for calcium, so it's taking time for things to balance, but they are all moving in the right direction. And we do see a huge increase in pollinators, beetles, spiders, small mammals, birds, wildlife in general, through managing the swards in the way we do on a rotational basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. We really appreciate that. It just shows what can actually happen out on the farm. So we thank all 4 of you for all your perspectives of your knowledge and experience of herbal leys. We're now going to do another poll. We'd like to answer what is the main hurdle or barrier to you using herbal leys. So if you could use your mouse and vote now, that would be much appreciated. So give you a few more seconds. Find your mouse. There we go. So 17% of you need a how-to guide. 36% have establishment issues. 28% unsure which mixes to use, and 18% unsure of the benefits they would bring to your particular system. Thank you, that's really useful and it'll help guide us going forwards. So as we labelled this session, this whole panel evening, it's a Q&A, and we now come on to the question and answer session. So I've got the first question here. Do they have anthelmintic properties? So can I take that one to Sam? Do you want to take that one, that question?
Yeah, of course, that's fine. So I think we've got to be mindful that yes, some species will, but it's not across the board. So we don't tend to find it in the grasses, but there are a couple with anthelmintic properties. So samphire would be one. It's a sort of plant that Rob could grow very well on the Cotswolds, on the light land, the alkaline soils, but doesn't favour the heavier stuff, unfortunately. So we know that has tannins, which is the anthelmintic properties, reducing the worm burden. Interestingly, chicory also does, although it is a different sort of compound or makeup than the samphire. And I think that more research needs to be done to chicory and why it seems to reduce the worm burden. We're not sure if it's quite the same mechanism as samphire, and possibly bird's-foot trefoil as well. So there's a few species in there, but bear in mind, depending on the soil type, will you or won't you be able to grow the samphire? You should probably be able to grow the chicory and the bird's-foot trefoil.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sam. So the next question is, Rob, can the composition of the sward be maintained or adjusted through grazing practices? If so, what is the best method of doing this?
Yeah, I think if each time the sward's grazed, it's grazed cleanly, it does help to get the persistence of the diversity. As I said there earlier, as these swards progress, they do naturally become grass dominant. If at some point then these swards are grazed hard in wet weather and bare soil is created, then some of the other herbs will come back into those spaces, especially things like chicory, partly because that root system will then help alleviate any compaction caused. But gradually these do go grass dominant, and it's why I favour putting many grass species in there and quite a few legume species. You know, we use 2 trefoils, a mix of clovers, so those all stay in there long term, where the herbs and the red clovers and such like do naturally quietly drop out of the system as the soil structure improves.
Okay, lovely, thank you, Rob. So I've got a question for Paul now. Are Herbal Leys funded in organic systems under current schemes?
Yes, they are. In countryside stewardship, the organic version of the Herbal Ley option is called OP4, or that's the code for it. The conventional one is GS4. The main difference between it is the payment rate, unfortunately, is significantly less. I believe the conventional one is about 300 some pounds per hectare, and the organic version is, I think it's 109 pounds per hectare. And the reason why is our payment rates are based on income foregone calculation. So in other words, it is the change in the profit you would be making. So the assumption is that in a conventional situation, the farmer would not be using any leys. So the incorporation of a ley, they would be sacrificing more loss of yield of crop. Whereas in an organic system, some type of ley is essential to maintain fertility. So it's a sense you're getting penalized for doing the right thing to begin with. So unfortunately, the organic payment rates aren't as good. Some of the management prescriptions are slightly different, but otherwise it's the same option.
Okay, so we've got another question linked to that saying, are there any constraints under ELS or countryside stewardship in how these are managed?
Yes, because we're trying to get we're trying to get multiple benefits from these swards, not just soil carbon improvements, but also benefits for pollinators. We do have constraints on when they can be cut. So there is a time period where there can't be cutting or grazing in order to allow the flowers to emerge and supply pollen nectar for pollinators. So there are a lot of people using Herbal Leys outside of schemes, primarily because they want more flexibility in how to manage it. And often that is due to wanting to graze it before things flower. So yes, there are some more restrictions in using it, but Herbal Leys are effective for a whole bunch of different reasons.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to put this one to Chris. Tell me if I'm putting it to the wrong person. Herbal Leys into permanent grassland. How do we make the Leys last longer? Sorry, with short-lived plant mix in current Herbal Leys. Does that make sense?
I think so. I might pass that one on to Sam,
Okay.
actually, but I think a lot's going to depend on the soil type where they're established and how they're managed, as Rob has been referring to.
Are you happy to pick that up, Sam?
Yeah, can I just add to that, Becky? Thank you. I think when we're looking at effectively overseeding existing pasture with this higher level of diversity, for me, the key is all about the preparation. Yes, some of the species Rob alluded to might die out over time, but to get them established in the first place, you've got to get the sward down as low as possible, might be cutting, might be grazing, and really open it up. Again, this could be a trampling effect, sort of overwintering maybe, if the soil will allow it, or harrowing vigorously, really trying to reduce the competition for the new seeds as much as possible, and then allowing them time to establish, not putting stock back on and leaving them on for the next sort of 6 weeks, because those seedlings are pretty delicate when they just pop up. So it could be a case of sowing, grazing for 3 or 4 days until the seedlings germinate, and then removing livestock for probably 4 or 5 weeks, I would have thought.
Right, so the next question is, and I think I might come to Chris and then to Rob, because you'll both have different answers, I think. Is there any work ongoing to come up with a solution for the control of injurious weeds in Herbal Leys? I'm a big fan of Herbal Leys, but controlling weeds is a huge challenge without causing collateral damage to legumes and herbs.
Yeah, I mean, Sam will remember when we were establishing our grazing platform at Cedar, we had a major problem. There'd been so much manure put on that particular field for so many years that chickweed was just an incredible problem. And ultimately, I mean, just being totally honest, we had so much chickweed, we were able to just spray it because all we sprayed was chickweed. But frequent cutting, I think it's kind of like establishing lucerne. We did quite a bit of work on lucerne in the past, and frequent cutting to keep the weeds under control and give the other species that you want to establish a chance to establish, I think is really important.
Okay, Rob, did you have an opinion on that? Because you're obviously organic. How do you control them?
Yeah, I mean, our main problem is we get a little bit of dock in places, mainly thistles. Mm-hmm. But the thing to remember is every weed tells you a story of what's going on underground, and both thistles and docks have strong tap roots, so generally appear where there's compaction. The difference between the two is docks favour soils which are rich in potassium, rich in salts, whereas the thistles tend to appear in soils which aren't as rich in the salts. Docks, if cattle can graze them, they'll tend to graze them out. And once they've done their job and opened the compaction up, they tend to weaken and disappear. With thistles, again, if the compaction is removed, they'll go. It's important to let the thistles do their job, get to flowering, and then if you top them at flowering, they will disappear and the root system will die back, leaving the fissures in the soil. And then we've thistles in our pastures, because we're out all the time, kind of ebb and flow. So some years we'll get a huge mass of thistles, especially in paddocks where we've kind of grazed them hard in wet weather and created compaction. If we allow the thistles to do their job and then top them at the right stage, by the following year we'll have far less thistles. You know, we've had fields that have been quite dense in thistles, and within 2 seasons we've virtually eliminated them by doing that. So it's all understanding what the weed is actually telling you about the soil structure, and allowing them to go through their growth cycles and hitting them at the right stage.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rob. The next one is, if herbal leys are cut for silage or hay, are there any particular challenges in maximising the nutritional value of the conserved forage? And what impact does cutting for conservation have on the overall value of a herbal ley? Does anyone? Shall I come to you, Chris, for that one?
I can just come back with our experience. We conserved our excess growth in our grazing paddocks as haylage, and that was round bale haylage. And obviously there are some stems that are a bit of an issue with plastic when you're making round bales, so that's something to be considered. But the digestibility of that haylage was comparable to the fresh cut material on a dry matter basis. So the nutritional value was still very good. And we harvested it about the same maturity, slightly more probably than we would have grazed the swards. But our experience with the haylage from our treatments, again, was very positive, and it had a similar DE value to the grazed material that we cut and carried to the animals.
Lovely, thank you. Sam, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to follow up on what Chris said, really, probably the biggest culprit from specifically hay is if it's left mature late, it can get stalky and lignified, and we've seen instances where the stalks are left in the feeders. So I think just be wary of making hay out of these very diverse mixes with the chicory in there. From a silage point of view, they can be cut, and it can be a useful way of sort of catching up if the lay is getting ahead of the livestock. Again, bear in mind that the stalky chicory can pierce wrap, but if you can cut it when it's still relatively fleshy, it can be inside, no problem. But yeah, just bear in mind it's when it gets to that lignified stage, it's about sort of probably this time of year onwards, it's a bit more of a danger.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Rob, question for you. How and or which calculator did you use to get the carbon sequestration at 25 tonnes per hectare? And do you expect to see this diminish as your soils improve?
A lot of that has been worked off the increase in soil organic matter. So 1% soil organic matter in the top 6 inches of soil contains about 60 tonnes equivalent of carbon dioxide in terms of carbon. So working what we've done in terms of lifting soil organic matters, we've done about half to a third of a percent a year, so 20 to 30 tonnes of carbon dioxide in the top 6 inches. As we've reached a certain level in the top 6 inches and soil structure has gone deeper, then that carbon and that high organic matter has spread deeper into the soils. Obviously on the Cotswolds, we are limited by the depth of soil that we have, but also it's quite high in clay, and a lot of the commentators say that the carbon content that or the maximum amount of carbon you can get in the soil is related to the clay content. So I still think we have room for improvement. We've got an even profile now with carbon going deeper. I still think we can get those levels up. People like Newman Turner said you can't grow a decent crop without 15 to 20% organic matter, so we still have some way to go. Going back to the previous question just briefly on silage, we've run on purely herbal leys for a long time now, grazed them and silaged them, cut hay from them. What I would say is for silage, you've got a much greater window to cut quality silage because of the diversity in the sward. We're always cutting first cut silage 11.5 ME plus 15+% protein, high D values, and you know, we've baled it, we've clamped it, we've made hay out of it. The sticking point with hay, if you've got stems in there, is getting the moisture out of those stems before you bale the hay.
Okay, that's good tip. Thank you very much. I've got a question for Sam now. How do your herbal leys fare in wet, very wet autumn winters like the ones that we've just experienced?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, definitely. And we've seen, to be fair, all sorts of leys suffering at times over the wet winter, whether it be the simpler stuff, the ryegrasses, or the more diverse ones in some cases. Interestingly, just thinking about those sort of wetter, heavier soils, we've got a lot in our sort of publications about light land and drought, but we do see the benefits on the heavier soils. I'm reminded about a customer down in Somerset on the levels who used to see sort of puddling over winter on their stuff because, of course, they're very low lying. With the deeper roots, the chicories, the plantains, and the sort of more fibrous cocksfoot and some of those deeper rooted species, they were finding that the soil structure and the drainage, getting that soil off the surface, was happening much quicker and much better, and they were able to get out earlier. So although the deep roots can be great from a drought point of view, I think from a sort of infiltration and opening up channels in the soil on the heavier stuff, it can be really useful as well. So sort of drainage, I suppose, is what I'm saying. Yeah. But we did see something suffering this year, of course.
Okay, brilliant. Right, moving on. On heavier soils where sainfoin is not suitable and red clover is more prominent, how significant is the risk of bloat when grazed by cattle, and how is this best managed? Does anyone want to volunteer to take that one? I'll have to pick on someone. Sam, have you had any experience on that?
A generic view, and Rob might back me up on it maybe as well. I think the bloat risk, I've seen 1 or 2 instances of bloat on these diverse wards, sort of unusual, but it does happen. The risk is there, especially with a high legume sward without some of the tanniferous species like the sainfoins and maybe the birds of trefoil. So being aware early in the season when things are growing lushly and not allowing animals to go out there too hungry, all that sort of stuff is definitely worth keeping in mind because there could be a risk.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if I just follow on there, speaking from experience, we've grown herbal leys for about 4 years before we converted to organic, with little problem. Just as we converted to organic, for some reason we had quite a bit of problem with bloat for a couple of seasons, and then I realised that bloat is caused by a build-up of ammonia gas in the rumen, and really the plants weren't utilising the nitrogen. We applied 100 kilos per hectare of salt, so sodium chloride, across the farm. It stopped cows taking rock salt pretty much altogether. It balanced the swards up, and with balancing the potassium up with sodium, you improve the translocation of sugars in the plant, and that seemed to balance up the protein. And touch wood, since then we haven't seen bloat, and to this day we put salt on 10 years ago, 1 application, and cows still take very little rock salt. So I think that seemed to work for us, and once that happened, we've grazed swards at all stages and had no issue since.
That's great. Thank you very much, Rob. Question for Chris now. What would be the calibration equation to use on the plate meter for herbal leys? $64 million question.
I get asked this question. I get asked this question all the time, and as I said in my talk, we just now got all our data pulled together from 3 years of our agronomy plots and our grazing plots, and we've got 10. Well, we had 11 to start with demonstration farms. We've got all that plate meter data as well. That's all calibrated against biomass. So we'll be working through that. I think there are issues with plate meters, just using them for ryegrass. So you have to be very careful. But we'll be able to publish relationships for the mixtures that we use in terms of height and biomass. But I think people are still going to need to develop their own approach in how they use their plate meters or other approaches for estimating biomass. So they're a guide. They're not going to give you an absolute value. That's how I would approach it.
Lovely, well handled, thank you. Okay, next question. This is the farmer down in Sussex, been using Herbal Leys for a few years, wanting to graze higher covers, 4,000 kilos plus, and mob graze. How do the panel think dairy cows will cope with that approach rather than grazing at the usual 2.8 to 3.2 cover? Rob, if we go to you first, because you've probably got more experience.
Yeah, we've grazed a lot of pastures at those sort of higher covers. It tends to be where we aim for. With legumes in flower, grasses just about to head. Dairy cows will take that quite cleanly and tend to do well off it. Where you struggle, well, it's not a struggle. They won't eat chicory stems. They'll take the tops off the stems and leave the rest. It looks a bit untidy, but other than that, they'll take pretty much everything clean and do well off it. When we first started growing them, we got up to about a 70-day round before we started to lose any milk off with covers getting too strong. So they were going into some fairly strong covers at that stage, so they will do well off it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Rob. Question for Sam. Tall fescue is a dryland plant. Can it be used in wetter areas?
Good question. If I was having to choose, I probably would leave it on the drier stuff, maybe using the meadow fescue if I was looking at the wetter soils, the heavier soils. We know it does favour those over the tall fescue if I was having to choose the two. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, is it possible to establish Herbal Leys into existing grass swards under organic rules without ploughing? Paul, do you know the answer to that?
Yes, if it is a temporary grass that you're trying to get the Herbal Ley well, I guess the question is this being done under a scheme? If it is, you can't be sowing it into permanent grass. That's restricted under the scheme. It is a ley, it has to be in a rotation. However, if you're just interested in diversifying your grass, you can sow Herbal Leys into it. It is more challenging to get it into permanent grass organically, although with enough surface disturbance, you should be able to get enough bare soil for the seeds to establish. I know some people are experimenting with spraying off swards and sowing direct drilling into it, but that wouldn't be allowed under organic systems. So you do have to rely on some kind of surface disturbance, either mechanical or through grazing.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Paul. Sam, a question for you. How would you go about reseeding a Herbal Ley? I've used Lamis, but now need reseeding. There's very little of the original mix left now, but it did do brilliantly. Probably I've cut it too often, and I'd like to avoid ploughing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's one of our other sort of more diverse mixtures with herbs and crops within it. As we were saying earlier on about the GS4 mixtures, there is an option to overseed and add in maybe things that might be missing. We know chicory can disappear after 3 or 4 years, maybe some of the plantains and other herbs. So you could either look to harrow hard, as Paul was saying, and broadcast, or maybe direct drill, but I think be very mindful if we are direct drilling into swards not to put stuff too deep. They're often big machines and powerful tractors in front, and we can get down to 2 or 3 centimeters quite easily, and we started to lose the seeds, and that's when the establishment suffers. So I would be favouring maybe harrowing after a cut or a graze and broadcasting, or if it's very dry, a very shallow sort of slit drill, something like that.
Okay, and while we've got you on, Mike, at what seed rate do you recommend? Our leys can be a bit open in early years, and wondered if a higher seed rate would be beneficial.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation. We do have that, people sort of mention that quite a lot. I think it's a balance with these more diverse mixes. We'd probably like a more robust sward, but the worry is then we might end up smothering out the more delicate species, the samfoins, the forage herbs, the burnets, the yarrows. So I think there is a sort of point, sweet spot, if you like, maybe a slightly higher sowing rate, or possibly adding in a little bit more of the sort of more ground covering species, maybe a little bit of perennial ryegrass, some of the finer grasses possibly, just to try and fill that sward in. The danger is if we put a lot of perennial ryegrass in a mix, I worry quite quickly you'd lose the other species because there'd be no space for them. So it's definitely a balance.
Okay, great. This is a question for Chris and Rob. What cover should be left at the end of the grazing season for overwintering if aiming for March, April turnout? And if we could cover, if it's different for different areas of the country, perhaps you'd include that in your answer.
I'll let Rob answer that question. Thank you.
Okay.
You're kind. Yeah, I mean, we're at 800 feet on the Cotswolds. Basically, we start the last round at the end of September and graze through till sort of the end of November. So whatever regrows from beginning of October is what we carry through, and aim to make the first round in the spring last until the end of April. So because by then we've got good regrowth to follow on. Obviously in warmer climates, then that first round can finish a bit earlier, but certainly these swards want time in the autumn to grow, and some of the broadleaf stuff especially is quite vulnerable to frost through the winter as well. So we don't want too much on there, and work on extending that first round to the end of April.
Brilliant. Right, moving on to the sheep, a bit cattle heavy. So this is a question for Sam. Do you have mixtures suitable for sheep?
Yeah, interesting question. We've actually got a bit of land that we look after, not a million miles from Rob, with these more diverse mixes. They've had nothing but sheep for the last probably 4 years now, no fertiliser at all, and just sheep grazing, mob grazing in this case, and it's worked really well. You wouldn't know it hadn't had any fertiliser, just what the sheep deposit. So that's worked nicely. We do tend to let the covers get quite tall because we're also trying to build some soil because we're on the thin Cotswold brash as well. So we have had situations where we let the sheep in and they disappear for half a day or so because the chicory is up to waste and all the other bits and pieces. But they're surprisingly agile at getting through that forage, and after 4 or 5 hours they'll be back in view again. They do tend to leave the chicory, they eat the chicory leaves first, all the way up the stem, then they take the top off, and then they leave a sort of stalky foot and a half or so. So I think most overlays would be fine for sheep. Just be mindful of overgrazing because they will graze tighter than cattle, and that's where we can start to damage some of the more delicate species. So I think probably more of a management issue maybe than anything. We've had 1 or 2 incidences on the more traditional breeds, maybe a slightly sort of looser walled breeds, where the mature chicory has caused some issues, some skin irritations, but again, unusual.
Right, thank you for that, Sam. Probably with you again, does growing herbal Leys require a certain soil pH, and does this affect uptake of minerals by cattle and sheep, i.e. do they need mineral supplementation?
I think if I can take the first bit first, the pH, yes, as we were saying earlier on, really, some species will and won't tolerate either alkaline or acidic conditions. So if you are particularly sort of heavy and more acidic, things like the red clovers or the all-site clover can do really well. Birdfoot trefoil maybe. On the more alkaline soils, suddenly the sandpoints come into play. Generally, the other legumes tend to quite like it as well, the lucernes maybe. I think the grasses themselves are probably a bit more robust across the range. I would have to bow to somebody else's knowledge on the mineral uptake. To be honest, a bit of research I did look at from an old book, actually, an organic book in the 70s, showed that the plantain and chicory have twice the amount of minerals and nutrients than a ryegrass plant. So I think, in terms of providing minerals through the plant species, whether they're rich in it or whether they can access it further in the soil profile, you're on the right step if you're looking at a sort of more diverse mixtures.
Brilliant. Okay. Does anybody else want to
Becky? Yeah, sorry, Becky. Just there's been a lot of interest in that because of the deeper rooting species, the potential to bring up or get access to more minerals. There's been a lot of interest in that, and we'll be looking at that with some of our samples as well. But there's current research ongoing about that. But it's certainly something that's talked about a lot, that some of these deeper rooting species in the herbal Ley mixtures will mean a higher concentration of some of the trace minerals in particular in the sward.
Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, one more question before we go to the poll. What role does the panel think bagged fertiliser can have with these herbal Leys, in particular nitrogen, phosphate, potash and sulphur? Who would like to take that one up? Don't all shout at once.
Yeah, I can give it a go. I think
well done.
The one that flagged, the red flag that came up there for me was the nitrogen. Just being mindful that if we've got a heavy legume sward and putting a lot of nitrogen on it, we will probably suppress the legumes, as Rob was saying, make them lazy, and you tend to get more of a grass dominance as well. The Leys we've grown on the thin brash soils, we haven't put any nitrogen on at all, and if you saw them today, even after all the dry weather this spring, you wouldn't have guessed that. So they are supposed to be self-sufficient. With guys like Newman Turner and some of the other ones, they set them up as a sort of fertilizer merchant anyway, so they shouldn't need a lot. Maybe a little bit early on in the spring if you're trying to push on grass growth, but really and truly, once the legumes start firing in sort of April time, May time, they should be doing their own thing.
Excellent, thank you. Right, we'll go to our third poll now. If we can pop that up. Oh, we've got Chloe joined us. Right, so the question is, what specific topics on herbal Leys would you like more information on? This is to guide us with our future delivery. So is it establishment, choosing a mix, ensiling, feeding and grazing management, or the environmental benefits? So if you could get your mouse into action and select one of those, that would be really helpful. Okay, has everyone had a go? Right, so 16% for establishment, 28% for choosing a mix, 2% for ensiling, 43% feeding and grazing management, that comes out tops, and then 11% for environmental benefits. Thank you very much. I think I can see which direction we'll be going in next for delivery for you people. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm just going to cover two more before we wrap it up. I've never had a webinar with so many questions. This is such a hot topic for all our attendees. Let's pick out one. We've done that one. Would you recommend herbal Leys on loamy clay, as herbal Leys are most often talked about on lighter soils? Is the management different? We come to you first, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's a nice one to finish on that, actually. It does cover what we talked about earlier on with thinking about the type of species you're using, steering away from the ones that don't like the heavier stuff, and the ones that do suit the heavier clays. As we were saying, the deeper roots can help improve the drainage and all that sort of thing. Depending how we're managing them, maybe be mindful of mob grazing on soils that might be prone to poaching in wetter conditions. So probably the management side of things would be possibly an issue, but we certainly have them growing on the heavier stuff. Just be mindful of the species you might be using.
Right, okay, and this will be the last one tonight. We could, oh sorry, go on Paul, thank you.
On that one too, on the heavier clay soils, they tend to be quite rich as well. And the one thing you might want to consider is putting in a little less grass in the mix, particularly perennial ryegrass. I know certainly on the richer soils, we tend to struggle more with grass dominance just because the fertility tends to be quite high. So in those situations, I might either increase the herb component or definitely reduce the amount of perennial ryegrass in the mix.
Excellent, thank you. This is another question for you, Paul. Would it be possible to have an option in the new elm scheme for permanent, semi-permanent grassland farms to sow herbal Leys for finishing lambs, thereby enabling grass farms to finish lambs more effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One issue that I have noted is that a lot of people are referring to Leys for permanent grassland, and a ley by definition is temporary. It's considered something that is in rotation with arable. So, but because they're so popular, people tend to start referring to herbal Leys as permanent grassland. Nonetheless, I think what this points out is the need for more diverse grassland overall. whether it's permanent or temporary. And I think that certainly the Herbal Leys have taught us that there are a multitude of benefits we can get by increasing the diversity in our grasslands. However, the management is a bit more challenging, both at the establishment phase and also the management of it does become more complicated over time.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. I've been advised we can carry on with a few more questions. We're allowed to run over a little bit. So I'm going to, is there any research on mixed species swards in dairy grazing systems in the UK? So Chris, we'll come to you for that one.
Right, I'm aware of work in, no, I'm aware of work in France. I'm not certain of any work in the UK. That's not to say there's not any, I'm just not aware of it. I believe there's work ongoing in Ireland. Of course, our smart grass mixture was based on a project that was a joint project between UCD and Teagasc in Ireland. That smart grass mixture was named after their project. And they've now moved to some work with dairy cattle, and grazing cattle are included in that. So they started with beef and sheep in their first iteration of the project. They've now got funding for further work, and they're including dairy cattle. So we're doing a limited amount of work at Reading and hoping to get more funding for more work with dairy cattle.
Excellent. We keep our fingers crossed for that. Sam, question for you. Given that chicory seems to be the most problematic constituent, do the benefits outweigh the disadvantages?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think, at times. Certainly on the lighter soils this spring, when it was really dry, it was growing and growing well, possibly almost a bit too much, and needs to be knocked back a bit in some of the reseeds. But it was reliable and it was there. We do have this sort of anti-worm effect. Again, not entirely sure whether it's the shape of the plant and how it's grazed, or whether it's the makeup of the plant itself. From a cutting point of view, it could be problematic, as we've said, going stalky later on. Maybe, and Rob might agree or not with this, once it's being grazed, you might run a topper behind the animals just to sort of try and reset the chicory and get it back to a leafier stage if it is starting to bolt. That could be one way of trying to manage it. Personally, I like it, and I think it's very good from a rooting point of view. If we can breed a non-bolting chicory, then we'll be set, but not yet.
Okay, so Rob can answer that, and he can also answer this. What grazing intervals are you using for your young stock in terms of resting fields?
Yeah, first of all, on the chicory, chicory is well worth putting in there. It produces a lot of forage. It's a high protein forage, 18 to 20% protein. The chicory stems are not a problem. Those that bolt, the leaf comes back around the bottom of the plant anyway. And what tends to happen is some of the flowers are left on there, so the environmentalists like it as well, because even though you've grazed the field, there's still something there for the pollinators. And then with young stock, our calves are on some permanent pasture as little calves, but the older young stock are block grazed, and they tend to be on a 30 to 40 day round. With those, it doesn't matter if they go into stronger stuff, you'll still get the growth rates out of it. And when you talked about the scheme, some of our grass that they were on was on HK21 scheme, which had to have a 35-day rest between grazings. The cattle were never off the field, but because they were on 24-hour breaks and they were usually up to about a 40-day round through the summer, then to my mind that was better than coming all off the field at once and then cutting it, because there was a continual supply of flowers for months through the season. So yeah, they tend to run on that 35 to 45 day round.
Great, thank you, Rob. Right, last question. Question for all. Apparently there are two types of chicory that don't produce milk taint. Is this true, and what are they? Does anybody know? Oh,
I believe there has been a cultivar developed that has fewer, I'm trying to remember the name of the compound that does cause taint, and I think there is a cultivar, New Zealand developed cultivar that has low amounts of this compound, but for the life of me, I can't remember it at the moment.
All right, we'll come back and answer that off the webinar.
Can I just,
Thank you. Go on.
sorry, from experience, we've grazed swards with high inclusions of chicory and not had any issues with taint either. So
okay.
yeah,
that's
just with the pure 2 chicory. So
yeah, okay. Thank you very much, everybody. I mean, we've got so many questions we could go on for hours and hours. We will answer them all. Thank you very much for sending them all in, and I'll now hand over to Tom Goatman to wrap up for us.
Okay, thank you, Becky. Well, yeah, that was an excellent session, and yeah, 1 hour hasn't done it justice really in terms of the questions that we've had in. But firstly, I'd like to thank the panel. Your knowledge and expertise tonight has been fantastic, and we have got to the bottom of sort of some of the queries that are out there. Just to pick up on some of the key points and summarise some of the points from this evening. So Sam, you were picking up the importance of knowing your soil type and picking the most appropriate species, and that's fundamental in order to then the ongoing success of growing the herbal Leys. The timing of sowing important, and also depth of sowing as well, very important to getting correct establishment. Paul, yeah, you covered where herbal Leys are being used, so their usefulness in arable rotations, popularity in improving blackgrass, but also as creating more diverse grassland swards, and getting the most, and in future is getting the most out of them for the particular system. Chris highlighted the importance they have in terms of reducing reliance on nitrogen fertilizer, some of the animal health benefits, but also some of the difficulties we have in terms of nutritional analysis of multi-species swards, and also some of the work that is ongoing and nearly there in terms of helping us to be able to answer some of these questions, such as correct plate meter calibrations, and some other experiments that are there looking at animal performance, and particularly that in the early years ryegrass outperforms herbal Leys, but they come into their own sort of in years 2 and 3. So that was interesting work you presented there. And finally, Rob, yeah, your description of how you've got on using multi-species swards and the benefits you've seen on your farm, and particularly the improvements in soil carbon that you've described, going from 3 to 4% when you started out, now up to 8 to 10%. So that was just highlights what can be done with multi-species swards. So I'd just like to thank the panel again for all their efforts this evening. I'd also like to thank all the attendees for asking the questions. As Becky said, we have a list of the questions, so any that we haven't got round to answering, we'll circulate those with an email that'll follow this session tonight. And there will also be a survey which will follow shortly, which would be grateful if you could fill out for us. I'd like to thank Becky for great facilitation this evening and fielding the questions, but also Chloe and Sian, who worked hard behind the scenes in order to get and pull the organisation of the webinar this evening together. Finally, I'd just like to say that on behalf of BGS and AHDB, it's been fantastic to be able to present this webinar this evening. The feedback you've given us has given us plenty to go at in terms of topics that we might cover in future webinars. So we will look very hard at that, and hopefully bring you look to bring you some more webinars looking at this topic. I'd also like to highlight that we are hoping to hold the BGS Research Conference next year, all being well with the COVID situation. We've got 3 sessions in that conference, specifically looking at establishment, sward management for grazing conservation, and utilisation and feeding value. So please keep an eye on the BGS website, where we'll post details as soon as we have further details on when we'll be able to hold that next year. But thank you again for attending tonight, and I hope you have enjoyed and got a lot from it. Thank you very much.